So I'm not sure what side I'm supposed to choose here, I have to say. I certainly feel if you're looking at the last 24 hours, if you're not scared by social media, you're not paying attention. I was just thinking today, if I went back to my 2008 self and said Donald Trump will be elected with the help of Facebook and will declare war on the Russians on Twitter in 10 years' time, I would have admitted myself to a psychiatric hospital, right? I mean, thinking about the way this has happened. If you're not angry when you see Mark Zuckerberg last night with the members of Congress, and to be honest, with both sides, you know, what was predominantly white men who probably had ties older than Mark Zuckerberg, asking the questions about what went wrong, and Mark Zuckerberg not really caring very much, except when it came to the notes in front of him. So I get why we're at a point now where we are angry and we are scared by social media. I just have to ask you for a moment, just for a couple of minutes, to just come on a journey with me, to think about a third reality in which the promise of social media hasn't even begun to be realized. That we have taken a detour, thanks to the tech platforms, away from the promise of what is, I feel, a revolutionary force. And I'm standing here and I'm mindful of listening, being in this position, listening to great college lecturers years ago telling me about Hegel, the dialectic. I don't know if we have any students here who remember that concept of every movement in history being the thesis, the conventional wisdom being challenged by this antithesis. And out of that came a battle of ideas that resulted in the synthesis. And I have to say, keep that in mind as you think about the way social media is evolving and has been evolving for the last 10, maybe 15 years. So for me, I am very much of the thesis. I believe in the democratic potential and the awakenings that came with social media. And I'm a really unlikely candidate. I'll turn 50 in a couple of months' time. I started out inspired by the likes of Ernie Pyle, the great World War II reporter who has a memorable dispatch from D-Day where he doesn't talk about the bodies in the oceans, he talks about the four-leaf clover, the good luck floating there amid the bodies, capturing that little detail that told a story in a way that other people who had got their facts right when the right datelines couldn't tell. I was brought up as a journalist to believe that it's not just about facts and timelines and statistics, it's about the visceral realities of the world around us, and as a journalist you're honored and privileged to try and capture those small things that can help sometimes unimaginable horrors sink in with real people and make a difference in their lives. So I went on to be inspired by other people like John Simpson, by Olivia O'Leary, to go out there and tell stories to real people, not to be a journalist standing there with a microphone saying incredible, dramatic things are happening behind me. I remember that visceral feel of being a journalist in the field. I can remember the sound of a sniper's rifle. I can remember thinking, where's it coming from and where's it going to? I can remember the impact on my ear of a car bomb in Baghdad. I can remember what it was like to be standing outside the Felons Club on the day of the IRA ceasefire with Irish Republicans who hadn't an idea what they were celebrating. And I remember years later standing in the West Wing, hearing the joy from the White House at the Good Friday Agreement. So all my life it's that sense of emotion and joy and the visceral realities that go around it. Whether you're sitting with, you know, held at gunpoint in Colombia by a young teenage rebel, or you're sitting with the Taliban in Kabul, there's something about those stories that I felt proud to report. But there was something lacking. Even as a foreign correspondent living that dream, there was something inauthentic about the way we told stories. It became with television that wars only happened wherever your satellite truck was parked. You know, wherever you were, wherever you were embedded, that was the war. And so we did get this kind of pastiche, this parody of reality sometimes from war zones. We got to the point where political debate, the space got smaller and smaller and smaller. We were just talking to this a moment ago about how TV current affairs programs could be more than an hour long. You could have an idea expressed and debated. Got to the point when I was on television that it was like being a referee in a boxing match that was over within 6 minutes. So there was a real disservice, I think, that journalism was doing to itself by essentially having no real sense of that visceral reality. It was losing it. I felt myself. And that's when Twitter came along. So for me, I remember my job at that time in 2009 was to ask questions of the powerful. It was just about the time that the financial crisis was hitting. And I remember being on Twitter and asking people, could they help me frame questions? And what I would find is I would have people who were working in the property market or in banks on Twitter were giving me questions that were so much better than anything I had thought of myself. I would go then into the late Brian Lenihan, who was the Minister of Finance at the time, and ask questions that I had sourced from listening to the audience on Twitter. I was such a better journalist for that experience. I also saw in Iran in 2009, there was this green revolution, as they called it, when there was a disputed election. And I remember not being able to go to Iran, which was my story, I felt, but listening and looking at the testimony of the 17 and 18-year-olds on the streets of Tehran, of northern Tehran, with their camera phones and their connections to social network, giving an authentic, visceral, raw, real testimony from the squares of northern Tehran, while the correspondents like myself were locked away in hotel rooms, repeating third-hand rumors, telling me that there were shots fired, apparently, on Valley Asr Square, as some 17-year-old was showing me the pictures of the bodies being taken off the squares, as I sat at home in Dublin. For me, suddenly I realized the crowd is not wise. There's no such thing as the wisdom of the crowd, but there is wisdom in a crowd. There are people who know more than you as a journalist, and your responsibility is to listen to those people. And so I suddenly realized how ridiculous it was that we would tell our audience to turn up at 9 o'clock at night or 9:30, sit there, listen to us, and not answer back. My daughter's 13 years old. She laughs at me when I tell her there was a day when you had to get a newspaper at a certain time in the morning because that was the way the news was delivered to you. You could not answer back. And I think for me, that's what social media gave me a sense of. It gave me a sense that there was a new way, a democratic avenue for the kind of raw and visceral detail that defined the stories of the day. And I'm not naive. I'm a student of political science in Trinity College. I believe in historical forces, and I believe very much that it's not enough to look at the actual object. You have to look at the momentum and the things that it creates. What I realized was there was a flaw. I realized that when everybody can tell a story, who do you listen to? When the world is talking, how do you cut through the noise to find the real story there? And how easy it is to manipulate the kind of raw and visceral images that you get through social media. So I set up a company. I left RTE. I was told in retrospect by a friend that he thought I was having a nervous breakdown, and they were planning to stage an intervention, that I left primetime to go and start a new company in a medium. I remember once a producer laughing at me saying, "Did you say the word Twitter on television?" As if I had said the word fart. It was like that was regarded as that ridiculous for a journalist to be using that word. What I found was a business that was born out of the Arab Spring. We had 4 or 5 journalists sitting in a small office by the banks of the Liffey on the day that, for example, Osama bin Laden was killed by the Americans. We were directing US journalists into the compound in Abbottabad. We were correcting Google, who had the wrong location on the map. We were the first ones to do analysis of the downed helicopter in that compound. 3 or 4 journalists sitting in Dublin. We then profiled the Arab Spring as it came out of YouTube. And again, that visceral, raw, authentic testimony. The nature of the story changed, but always we could see that there was something here that was more powerful than so much of the reporting that I had done in my 20 years in journalism. The antithesis that I talked about became very apparent when the forces that were opposed to this democratic awakening start realizing that they could weaponize tools that were by definition democratic. They could manipulate the business model of social media, which has been to harvest your attention as the product, like your fields of corn. Just hoover up all the data that you create every day and then fire back with these algorithms at you things they think you want to see. And so we see what happened with the trolls and these armies of bots that I think it's a clear-cut case. There was influence not just in the US election, but also more recently, I think all over Europe we see the influence as well. So I'll just bring it to an end by saying that is the antithesis. We saw that with Zuckerberg the other night. We saw it with Cambridge Analytica. But do not mix up social media with the technology companies that have controlled it in its first phase. Do not mix up social media and the business model that has perverted the growth and expansion. And do not mix up this centralized walled garden system that Facebook illustrates with the promise of a decentralized and open web in which that raw, visceral testimony from ordinary people can emerge, and in which we as journalists have a new role, and that is to manage this overabundance of testimony in a way that tells a story in the way that Ernie Pyle did when he walked along the beaches of Normandy. So for me, there's changes. I'd like to talk about the specifics of business models in a moment. I've got some ideas. I have a company that is all about giving you back control of your experience of news in a way, I hope, that will open minds again to unlock that democratic potential. Again, there's specifics I'd like to talk about, I'm sure. I've talked with Olivia about this subject before, so I know we choose to disagree on certain things. But again, think about Hegel. And remember this, the final thing I'd say is, Silicon Valley's philosophy is bankrupt. Silicon Valley philosophy, when you walk into a Facebook office, there's a mantra on the wall that says, move fast and break things. Right? We're in an age now, in this synthesis, where we do the exact opposite of what Silicon Valley told us. We move slowly, and we build, and we reconstruct a system of news that captured the authority and the authenticity that we work so hard to bring to journalism, but mixes it with that testimony, that democratic potential that social media, I think, still has. So let's move slowly and rebuild. Let's talk about some details in a moment, but thank you very much for that.